Hello everyone and welcome to the latest edition of our 1515 podcast. As you can see, we've decided to switch our videos on. I'll let you all decide whether or not you think that's a good or a bad thing. I'm Chris Capewell. I'm the partner and global head of the regulatory team here at the Maples Group, and joining me today is Patrick and Nikki Wood. Pat is a fellow partner and Nikki is a senior associate in the team. And then just the usual point that we always make, this podcast isn't legal advice and should not be taken as legal advice. I did also just want to say, if you want to subscribe to us, don't forget to subscribe on Apple, Spotify, and Google. The topics that Pat and Nikki I'd like us to discuss today, if we can, is the recent CIMA FAQ on corporate governance. That was an interesting one that just came out. CIMA Thematic review, the CIMA warning notice on phishing emails, Virtual Asset Service Providers Amendment Bill. I think there was the SAR Consent Regime, usual BOTA reminder. And then lastly, I think, Pat, you were going to touch on some director deregistration points. So Nikki, with video on, are you able to just track us through corporate governance and the CIMA FAQ, please?
Yes, thanks, Chris. So yes, quite helpfully yesterday, CIMA issued an FAQ on the number of operator meetings that can be held during the year. So what they're saying is particularly useful for entities that have perhaps not already had their operator meeting. So the new FAQ is saying that the new meeting can be held within 6 months at the end of the reporting year and prior to the submission of the fund annual return form. So what that means is if you are going to do that, if you're reporting at the end of the financial year, then you do need to put in the minutes that it's clearly stating for which financial reporting period you're reporting on. CIMA has said that you can't double count. So if, for example, your financial year end was the 31st of December 2024, you had your meeting in January, you are reporting on that 2024 period, you can't then use that meeting as your 2025 meeting, even if you have mentioned some items that are applicable to 2025 in that meeting. So useful FAQ on CIMA's website for entities that perhaps struggling to schedule their operators meeting by the next few weeks.
Do you also want to just track us through the CIMA thematic review?
Yeah. So in November, CIMA issued a thematic review on corporate governance. They looked at 19 different licensees, and they really found that only 1% of entities had kind of failed to implement their new corporate governance framework. We have seen CIMA doing inspections of registered persons and licensees, and they have quite draconiously been going through the new rule on corporate governance and looking at corporate governance policies in relation to what it says in the rule. So just to look at some of the best practices that were identified, again, documentation, if it isn't documented, it didn't happen. So good practices, thoroughly documenting your corporate governance framework, thoroughly documenting the minutes of the governing body, making sure that potential conflicts of interest are disclosed. If you said that you'll be declaring interest in one form, CIMA has picked up on that and said that, they want you to be consistent, that that's the form that they see the conflicts are declared on. We have seen kind of new work in terms of oversight and reporting that have been implemented, and this has been received well by the Cayman Islands Monetary Authority. Reports coming in from the different outsourced service providers. And as CIMA says, if it isn't documented, it didn't happen. So looking at the different board charters and corporate governance policies, all outlining what the board of directors or the governing body should be doing. So they're the best practices. So then looking at some of the areas for improvement, they did pick up on the fact that some notifications to regulators were noted within 10 days of any substantive changes in the corporate governance frameworks and documentation. The kind of failure to identify succession plans, like succession for key roles of the senior management and the board of directors, objectives and strategies of the entity. Often that's not something that's documented and then tracked through in the governing bodies. And also equally that there may have been informal meetings, which is fine to have, but if you do want to have your key decisions documented in minutes that are disclosable to the regulator, then you need to formally document those and have that disclosable. So if you are having informal meetings, think about the level of documentation that's required in those meetings. So that's all I wanted to cover, Chris. I think next I was going to talk about the phishing emails that have been coming out from.
Yeah, please. There's been a couple of those, I think. So if you can touch on those, that'd be great. Thanks, Nikki.
Yeah. So CIMA has published a couple of warning notices around phishing. One of the actual emails that was coming out was from AML surveys at CIMA.ay, which is actually a legitimate email address from CIMA. But somehow this site has been cloned, and there are emails coming out from Christopher Buick around saying that it's actually originated from CIMA. So if you do see a request coming from CIMA, I would always, use a telephone number from CIMA's website to verify that the information that CIMA is requesting is actually what it should be, and that it's not fraudulent. There have been some schemes going on around kind of offering fund recovery and cryptocurrency conversion services and things like that. So just to be mindful about verifying that the email address is actually and the request is actually valid.
Yeah, or I guess just drop us a line, right? Or your usual Maples contact. I think we've got pretty good visibility over most of this when it's happening, and we'll know which ones are genuine ones that are going out. So if you do receive something, as Nikki said, just pause, either flick us an email or just sort of confirm that it is a genuine request from CIMA. Okay. Anything else, Nikki?
Oh, that's all from my side.
Awesome. Thank you. Pat, over to you. Do you want to track us through some VASP amendments?
Yeah. Recently, the authority just issued the most recent amendment bill to the Virtual Asset Service Providers Act. This really is in relation to the tuning on of the license aspects of the regime. So that's for trading platforms and custodians. The changes to the Act are really just, as I said, sort of tidying up points that help really facilitate the two license aspects. I think industry was kind of hoping for some further, more wide sweeping changes, a little more clarity around items like tokenization of real world assets and tokenization of investment funds, etc. Those changes, I think, are still in the works. So I think industry is still hoping that there will be some further enhancements, some updated guidance in that regard, maybe in the new year. But the changes that have been made kind of just bring into alignment some of the authority's powers, which it has under other regulatory acts and regimes, just in terms of their enforcement, the ability to ensure that entities, are providing audited financial statements if requested, that the material changes are notified to the authority under this particular regime within 30 days. It also clarifies that the authority has the power to provide waivers where they may determine that you don't need to be registered under this particular act if you may be, say, regulated under, for example, CIMA, or vice versa. And also, I think hopefully this will translate through to, say, tokenized funds, where if what you are doing is essentially using blockchain technology for administration of a fund, comfort that you just need to be regulated under either the private funds or mutual funds regime, that you're not necessarily a VASP as well, just because, for argument's sake, rather than a paper share certificate, you now have a token for your equity or interest. So there's a few tweaks in the edges there, but we're just hoping we'll get some more clarity on this sector in the new year.
And Pat, are you seeing more and more digital / virtual asset queries in your practice?
Yeah, I am. I mean, to be honest, there's been a very large uptick in interest really since the announcement of the US elections. I think that really has had a major effect globally on all of the crypto markets. I mean, even over the last sort of 18 months and building up to the most recent, presidential announcements, where we've seen more institutional clients become particularly interested in this space.
You touched on the US presidential elections. I was going to talk about BOTA next, but I think probably important also just on the US corporate transparency. There's been some really significant developments there. Very recently, I think it was around the 3rd of December, there was a district court decision in Texas, I think it was. I have the name here, Texas Top Cop Shop versus Merit, where basically the ruling in that court suspended the enforcement of the US Corporate Transparency Act and all of the associated requirements. So unlike prior rulings on the CTA, this injunction wasn't limited just to the plaintiffs, but it applies nationwide. So I think that's an important point too, stemming from the US election, is that CTA, Corporate Transparency Act, is very much a watch this space. We do have a dedicated team here in Delaware, so to the extent clients do want to talk about the US Corporate Transparency Act, please let us know and we'll put you in contact. And then just in terms of domestically beneficial ownership, just the usual reminder, everything comes into effect, enforcement comes into effect, I should say, on 1st of January 2025. So before that date, please do get in contact with your service provider to ensure that you've identified all of your in-scope entities and that you've provided the required information under BOTA. Obviously, Maples can assist in any way that you may need for BOTA. I guess an important update on BOTA was that a few days ago, on the 9th of December, we did have the regulations that were gazetted dealing with the access to the beneficial ownership register and also the ability for people to apply to have their information non-disclosed on that. And that's basically where there's a prohibition on disclosure because the person, an individual, so it will normally be the senior managing official or the registrable beneficial owner, is at serious risk of kidnapping, extortion, serious harm, or violence if their details were to go on that register. So those regulations have now been gazetted. We now have the standard application form that would need to be used, and I think the fee to make the application is Cayman Islands dollars 1,000, which is about US 1,250. So that's the points I guess I want to make on Cayman BOTA and also US Corporate Transparency Act. And then the final point from me that I want to talk about is just the Proceeds of Crime Act here and the amendments that were going to be pushed through on SARS and the consent that was going to be needed. That was intended to commence on 2nd of January of next year, and we think that commencement has now been delayed to sometime later in 2025. There's going to be a full industry consultation on this, and that will specify how the consent regime will need to operate. So just be aware of that implementation date has been postponed or pushed out, and expect some form of industry consultation on that one.
Yes, Chris, I was receiving a lot of questions on that actually, because obviously there's that risk of tipping off if your fund disclosed a suspicious activity report and then you've received a redemption request, so you need to distribute some dividends, and you can't then do that without having the consent from the regulators. So how does that balance? So I think we do need further guidance on how that will actually work in practice.
Yeah, completely agree. It's come up quite a lot, actually, I guess, because of our role is that we're often dealing with the compliance teams within organizations, and it's coming up in a fair amount of meetings where they're asking for the clarity on it, timing around it, and what the process may mean, because there is potential liability there. So it will be key when that comes through that we're involved on the consultation too. Pat, can I just flick over to you? I think you want to talk about director registration.
Yeah, it's really just a couple of year-end points to note. Obviously, with director registrations, it's a sort of a point we see at the end and the beginning of every year. If you are a director on funds that are deregistering this year and will not, you're not going to be continuing on a covered entity into 2025, remember you do need to deactivate or cancel your registration on the portal and pay the surrender fee to do that. Otherwise, if you roll into 25, you will have to pay the 25 annual fee plus the deregistration fee. So that's always a bit annoying. So it's just really a bit of a housekeeping point. I would obviously also stress for those clients who have decided to wait for a whole 11 and a half months to file their ES returns. If you do for financial year through in December, you should make sure you've got a couple of weeks to get those in as well.
All right, Pat, thanks very much. Nikki, thanks very much. Wishing everyone the best for the end of the festive period coming up, and we'll speak to everybody in the new year.